happening. It's often the first Sunday of Advent. This year, the way the calendar works out, it's not. So sometimes you kind of have this interesting question of what do we do with that Sunday between Thanksgiving and Christmas, because it's just different. It's technically Christ the King Sunday. So what do you do with that Sunday? Well, I decided it was maybe good after a Thanksgiving weekend, at the end of Thanksgiving weekend, to reflect on gratitude, but to do so maybe in a way that kind of begins to prepare us for what is to come in Advent Christmas. So years ago, I was watching a talk show, and there was a high-ranking politician on the talk show who was there to talk about a particular international incident that had happened, and it was all in the news. And the talk show host at some point finally said, "So tell me, how much does the average American really know about that situation?" And without hesitation, the politician said 2%. And the talk show host pushed back. "Oh, come on. We got to know more than that. We got to know more than 2% of what's really going on in that situation." And the politician shook his head and said, "No, really, there's so much more to what's going on, and no one can talk about it. We can't publicize that information. We can't." Now, whether or not you would believe the politician is another matter. We'll reserve, we don't know. But the principle stuck with me. The principle stuck with me. That so often there are things that we observe in a person's life, in a situation, and we really know so little of what's going on, right? We really know so little. But we're pretty quick to come to a judgment. We're pretty quick to say, well, this is what I think is happening, or that's what I'll bet. I mean, we rush to judgment. Our culture not only encourages that, it rewards that. I mean, there are people that make a lot of money doing that in media. We reward coming to judgment very quickly about a situation that often we really don't know much about. So what do we do with that information? Because, we learn lessons from childhood, right? Don't judge somebody until you've walked a mile in their shoes, kind of a thing. We've all heard that kind of thing, that we really don't know what's going on in a situation, and so we must reserve judgment about that, because there's always more to a situation than meets the eye. Well, that's certainly true of the Bible. If you have heard me speak very much, I'm always kind of digging below the surface. There's always more to mine there. There's more to draw out, and so we always take a deeper look at some of the scripture passages. Today's passage, certainly, there's the lesson that we learned much of the time as children. That lesson of that Jesus did this wonderful thing for these 10 people, and only one returned to say thanks. Now, part of that is just a truism that has to do with so often we all have great things happen and we don't say thank you. But part of it, as we would teach our children, is always be sure to be the one to return and express gratitude, to say thanks, to realize what a great gift this was. And so we have that surface meaning of the story. Indeed. And that's important, and that's good. But that's about 2% of the story. That's about 2%. Now, don't worry, we're not going to cover the whole 98%. Today, we might be here a while if we did, but we're gonna get there. So I want to revisit the story, but add a little more dimension, a little more texture to the story, because there's some really important aspects to this that help us to understand the message of gratitude is a far deeper and wider impacting message than what we might know. So Jesus goes into this village while he's on his way to Jerusalem. Now, that's important in this regard. The way Luke wrote this gospel is that back toward the end of chapter 9, it says Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem. In other words, from that point on in the Gospel of Luke, you have to read all that it's said, all that happens in the light of, through the filter of the fact that Jesus is going to Jerusalem, where he will be betrayed and arrested and crucified and risen from the dead. That all of that has meaning throughout these stories that are told. And in a sense, all the Gospels are written retroactively, right? Retrospectively. They're understanding what has already happened in the end as they write the Gospel. So Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He is on a mission, so to speak. And he enters into this village, and 10 people with leprosy come to him. They initiate contact with him. Now, they do it the right way. Leprosy in the Bible just really refers to any kind of skin disease, some kind of noticeable skin disease. That could be a really bad rash, that could be eczema, that could be all kinds of things. And they just used the general term leprosy, and it could have been leprosy too. So, folks who had that kind of condition were shunned to the outside of the community. And you probably know this. They were pushed to the outside. They had to live outside the community and were not to have contact with other people. Now, some of this, and this was true in other ancient cultures as well, some of this was for what we would call today public health reasons. I mean, they didn't know what this was. They didn't have medical knowledge. They just saw somebody with some kind of skin problem, and they're like, we don't know what that is, and you need to stay outside the edge of the community because we don't want that. We don't know what that is. I mean, the person who comes into the office and they're like, oh, I'm okay. I have 101 fever, but I'm okay, and I've been throwing up all morning, but I'm here to work, right? And what do you want to do? You want to say, no, leave. Get out of here, right? I don't want to get what you have. Yes, I've been through that before with other people. And I'm like, no, would you please go home? Don't throw up in the trash can. No, sorry, no, get out of here. So some of it's kind of a public health thing, but of course what happens is then we attach a label to it. They're lepers. It's not just a person who has leprosy. It's not just a person who has a condition. It's a leper. You see this? You see the change? You see the shift? How we label somebody? And once we do that, once we categorize somebody, once we label somebody, well, then we react and relate to that person by the label, not the person. So these 10 people come to Jesus. They do it the right way because they keep their distance, it says. They know they have to keep their distance, and they have to announce themselves. They have to announce that what they would say is they're unclean, 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 to let everybody know that they're aware they are unclean, which means they cannot have contact with anybody in the community. Wow, how horrible would that be? Walk down the sidewalk announcing your condition. So they are announcing themselves to Jesus, and Jesus stops and they say, Master, have mercy on us. Master. Now, interestingly, in the Bible, the only people that call Jesus Master are the disciples. Except for about 3 occasions when it's someone who is in dire need. Master, have mercy on us. And so Jesus says, go and show yourselves to the priest. Right? You notice that? He doesn't say you're healed. He doesn't say go get in the pool of whatever and you'll be fine. No, he just says go show yourself to the priest. Because for someone who has had a condition of whatever kind that was unclean in the community, the way that changed was the priest had to declare that you had been cured, you had been healed, you were now okay. The priest had to do that. So Jesus said, go and show yourselves to the priest. And on the way, they found they had been healed. On the way. Now, one of the things to note about this, I think is important, is that these people took initiative. They exerted their own agency. It wasn't just they're going to sit back, well, Jesus, take the wheel. I need you to do this now. They initiated by contacting Jesus. He said, go see the priest. They went to see the priest. They did the things that in the midst of that faith, they were made well. We don't know if they really went and showed themselves to the priest, right? It doesn't say. The point is, though, one did return. One did return, and he didn't just say thank you. He laid on the ground and worshiped Jesus. He worshiped, he glorified God, and he gave thanks. Interestingly, the Greek word used there for giving thanks is Eucharisto, which is the same word for Eucharist, of course, and the same word that Jesus used when he sat at that last supper with his disciples, and he broke bread and gave thanks. Eucharisto. So, I mean, obviously Jesus sees the guy, and he starts looking around and says, weren't there 10 of them? Anybody else see it? I think I saw 10. Where are they? But just this one comes back. This one who is a Samaritan, this foreigner, has come back. Okay, well now we got to ask questions about that, right? Why Jesus talking about somebody? Is he categorizing somebody here? Is he labeling somebody here? Excuse me. So, a quick word about Samaria and Samaritans. There's a geopolitical thing going on here. In the south, you had Judea, which is where Jerusalem was. Where the temple had been for hundreds of years. That was the center. That was the magnet. That was what drew people in to worshiping God in the Jewish tradition, and everything orbited around Jerusalem. North of Judea, you had Samaria. North of Samaria, you had Galilee. You remember, Jesus was from Nazareth in Galilee. So to get from Galilee to Judea, you had to go through Samaria, or because of the hatred and because of the rivalry, a lot of people would go around, literally adding days to their travel, because they would not set foot on Samaritan soil. They would go around. Now, all of this is because hundreds of years earlier, I mean, boy, talk about rivalries and grudges living a long time. We might still be seeing some of this play out now. Hundreds of years earlier, when Samaria was part of the world overtaken by the Assyrians, over time, they began to adapt to the new culture of the Assyrians, which means, because we're all product to some extent of our culture, we can say, oh no, I'm above culture. Oh no, we're all part of the culture that we're in. And they began to adapt different practices and different beliefs, and they began to marry with people who did not come from a Jewish heritage, and they began to all kinds of different things. And so that was really resented by people in the southern part around Jerusalem. And so they were no longer the folks who lived in Samaria who had a difference in life, who had adapted to some different changes. No, those were Samaritans. You see the label? Those people there. Well, in the early part of this passage, it said that Jesus was in the land in the territory between Galilee and Samaria. Well, how is there land? What do you mean, land between? What do you mean, the territory between? There's a border. There's a line, right? There's a line. What do you mean be between? It's in the area in the territory between Arizona and New Mexico. Well, no. In the territory between, no, there's a border. There's a line. We like drawing lines. We like lines, right? We like doing that because then that gives us a sense of who's in and who's out. And somehow, most humans, this is true of all humans, feel very confident that they know how to draw the line in the right way in the right place, right? Yeah. So, what do you mean the territory between? There's no way. I mean, you could stand on either side, kind of straddle the line. But what do you mean the territory? Well, he's talking about the borderlands. He's talking about borderlands. We have borderlands here in Arizona. Because of, through my adult life, because of family that lived in El Paso and because of my previous work where I spent a fair amount of time in El Paso, the borderland is a real thing. I'm sorry, friends. There's not a distinct line. You can say what you want. It doesn't work that way. There's not a distinct line. When I was a kid, we would go to El Paso and walk across the bridge and go to Juarez, and we'd go to the market, we'd go eat, we'd go to the bullfight, Yeah, it's the borderland. It's just, and people go back and forth every day. And I was on Paisano Drive, if you're familiar with El Paso at all. It goes down at one point along the river, and I don't know why, but that day I needed to go stop at a grocery store. Saw a grocery store. I'm going to stop there. I go into the grocery store. Every sign in the grocery store is in Spanish. Every sign. I was in El Paso. Every sign was in Spanish. Fortunately, I knew what I needed, and I could converse enough to make it all work. But it's the borderlands, the territory between. That's where Jesus was. That in a sense, both Jesus and these men who had leprosy were kind of both on different ground. They were not kind of exactly in Samaria, not exactly in Galilee, that maybe they were on a neutral ground where they met. That adds a little bit of depth to the story, right? This is a different thing. Yeah, one of the things we struggle with, and especially in privileged societies, is that we struggle with a sense of entitlement. That we are the ones that can say where the border is, where the line is. We are the ones who can tell you who's in, who's out. We're the ones who can tell. And when things go the way we want them to go, we can feel a sense of gratitude. Because it worked out the way it's supposed to work out. Right? It worked out the way it's supposed to work out. I knew it should have worked out this way. It worked out that way. Yeah. And I feel grateful for that. So how grateful might we feel when grace is a surprise? How grateful might we feel when compassion is completely unexpected but freely given? To understand that maybe that sense of entitlement, certainly that's not a Christian thing at all. And I think Jesus pretty much approached these things with humility and grace. So when I was a district superintendent in New Mexico, I was based in Albuquerque, but my area was basically the northwest quadrant of the state of New Mexico, which included the Navajo Nation, which spills, of course, into Arizona and Utah. And in my first year, found out that a pastor who had been at a church in the Navajo Nation for a long time, he had been there many, many years, had been a very influential pastor. He was finally going to retire. He had been talking about it a long time. He finally said, yep, it's time. I'm going to retire. So I told him, I said, well, I want to come and meet your church and meet the people. I've never been there, and I want to have some conversation. And he said, yep, sure, let's arrange it. So we set a date. He said, we'll have a lunch. You can talk with the members of the congregation. Great. So I go up there, and they're very gracious to receive me. And first thing was the worship service, which, by the way, was a 2-hour worship service. Remember that. No. But it was a very, very spirited worship service. And then we had lunch, and it was a potluck. I mean, they all made their traditional food. So fry bread and Indian tacos, and oh my goodness, man, food was delicious. They were wonderful. It was gracious. And then it came time for the meeting, and it didn't take very long before I began to realize, wait a second. I'm the guy in the suit from the corporate office in Albuquerque, come out that much of the time to kind of say this is what's going to happen. When, by the way, the 2 previous district superintendents before me had never visited there. And all of a sudden I had a really different perspective, because all of a sudden I realized I'm the foreigner here. I'm the foreigner. And some of them were very clear. We don't know if we can trust you. We've been told things before, and it didn't happen. As I'm sitting there, my mind is spinning because I'm thinking, yeah, the very reason that you're here, located on this land right here with the borders that are around it, were not their choice. Wow, that's a humbling thing. Kind of changes your perspective just a little bit. In the end, we had a great meeting. In the end, it went well. It took a little while to get there, but in the end, it went well. And I'm telling you, when I walked away from that potluck lunch, I felt a whole different level of gratitude than I'd ever felt before at a church. It just meant something different. Gratitude just hit different because there was way more to the story than I knew. We encounter borders all the time. Sometimes they're not necessarily physical borders. Sometimes it's the border of a difference in race, in religion, in politics. Wow, is there a region between Democrat and Republican? I just thought of that. We like to draw this really distinct line. Is there a territory between I don't know. We'll find out, won't we? We'll find out. Unless we start to create a territory between the two. Just a thought. Just a thought. We encounter all kinds of borders that have to do with religion, politics, race, language, education level, socioeconomic status, all those things. What would it look like to understand I could be a border crosser here? I could extend myself across this sociological border between me and them because I'm different than that person, and I could cross that border with, not entitlement, but I could cross that border with compassion and grace, love and kindness. So, one example of that I was told about, I did not witness it, but when I did live in Albuquerque, there was somebody from the church I served who was going into the grocery store. Well, there were a lot of people going into the grocery store, a lot of people coming out of the grocery store. You know how that goes. And up ahead of her, she saw a young woman come out of the grocery store who was dressed in typical Muslim dress, head covered, everything. And so she came out, and a man confronted her when she got out of the door and began yelling at her, calling her names, telling her to go home, all those kinds of things. And this person telling me the story said the young woman just stayed very still, but as she got close, could tell the girl was shaking. And when the man kind of finally stopped his tirade, she said, in a perfectly American accent, said, "I am home. I was born in Albuquerque." And the man yelled at her some more and then walked off.